Welcome to Open Culture. We have activist Don DeBar on this week to tell us about the Occupy Wall Street movement and other insights. Hey, Don.
Hey, Bob. How you doing?
Not too bad. How you doing?
Not too bad.
So what's up with that Occupy Wall Street?
You want the short answer or the long answer?
I want both.
Okay. The short answer is that there is a international phenomenon going on where people are gathering and interacting under basically direct democracy models of consensus building to they're gathering because there's something terribly wrong. This is being perceived by people all over the world, and that's at the base of it. And they're gathering to discuss lists of exactly what those things are and propose solutions because they feel that the political and economic structures that exist are just not viable vehicles for addressing their concerns.
So who is Occupy Wall Street? You see that on the corporate media. What's your understanding of who it is making that?
It's a slice of the people, basically. It's leaderless. It's not. It's a direct democratic model. So that means that there's no representatives per se. The people that are involved represent themselves, and the things that issue from these congregations of people are consensus things that were arrived at by process of reaching that consensus. It sounds a little elliptical, but these are expressions of or attempts at a direct democratic governance structure, and the first task is for people to identify what issues concern them, reach a consensus on that, and at some point, presumably, they will decide that there's something that needs to actually be done about those demands, and so they will either raise the demands and place them at the feet of someone or someones, or take direct action to achieve the fulfillment of those demands. That's
maybe you can explain the concept of the General Assembly and the human microphone.
Yeah. So yeah, let me explain it in human terms. I'm kind of doing like poli-sci explanations right now. People have. I'll use an example, Zuccotti Park in New York City. I've been there a few times. I know you've been there too. So, and I understand you've been running some video, just without comment of what was happening when
little jump circle on it too. Did you hear what the Community One board did? By the way, their edict, they can only have 2 hours now of jump circle.
Yeah, they've they've had apparently they reached an agreement with. But this is I don't want to get off topic yet, but I mean off the track. These people have congregated at different locations around the country. We'll talk about Zuccotti Park. People basically did a sit-in and occupied the place. And the people didn't all know each other that did this. There was a word put out. And
this goes back to the beginning of August, right? Or was it late July?
Yeah.
And this started off with like about 5 or 10 people, right?
There were more than that, but not thousands. I think I wasn't there at the very beginning, but from when they started to broadcast live from there, which is something that they began to do early, they started to send over an internet website live video feed showing what was happening. When I started to see this on the live stream, and that was in, I guess, the early mid-September, there were hundreds of people that were there at that point. But in any event, so what happened is people congregated and they started to adopt a model of reaching consensus. Basically, how do we figure out why we are all here and have that which brought each of us here be expressed through the group and supported by the group? How can we come to that point? And so they invented and or borrowed from other points in history, places on the planet, where people have raised the question before, and generally in I would say revolutionary periods in history, or in different parts of the world, and found a way to. They had essentially what they call the General Assembly. Now, there are a number of terms of art that are used in politics for what this assembly actually is. They've called it's been called a General Assembly, it's been called a Popular Assembly, it's been called a People's Assembly, or a Popular or People's Congress. It's a gathering of people that sit down and say, none of us is going to represent anyone else. We're here as ourselves to figure out what issues we have in common, and which issues we have that even if we don't have them in common, that we can work on in common, and that look to find a construct through which they can achieve a consensus on the list of things to do, and perhaps an agreed upon methodology to follow to actually get them done. So that started very early, and that is one of the trademarks of the movement, to the extent that it is one, that it's being debated everywhere. I've been involved, for example, in a discussion of this with people in Los Angeles who have been, the Occupy Wall Street LA group, and particularly, rather than inside that group, a bunch of activists in the Los Angeles area, older, like old people like me that I know, who
But
are.
you're not a day over 30. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm over 30 and then almost again. But of people that have been involved in as activists in LA for years, in some cases decades, of figuring out how to relate to what has been largely a phenomenon of young people that hasn't been, I won't say tainted, but hasn't been cast by previously existing political, social.
So you would say like some
constructs.
people have accused it of being like the Democrats funny money, and
Yeah,
that's there's like a lot of myths about this. So I want you to have you on the
these are
show.
all myths. Yeah, these are all myths. It's not anybody. There are people that say it's George Soros. There are people that say it's the Democratic Committee. There are people that say that they're fascists and Republicans, or whatever, that they're of the right or the far right.
Well, it's just interesting now that you have labor have come in.
Yeah, well, you've had labor unions. Well, in the United States, you have questions about whether labor unions are on the left or right politically, too. I remember the Teamsters in the 1960s, for example, helped to bring Richard Nixon into office, and I remember the union guys who were mostly just white men at that time in the late 60s, early 70s, being completely in political opposition to anti-war demonstrators and others. So just the fact that it's, I would say unions rather than labor, because labor is larger than unions, unfortunately. That doesn't necessarily mean left or right in the United States, although in many other places it does. Anyway, so, but you've had the phenomenon of unions joining big time in a number of cities around the country. And also, just one interesting phenomenon, I mean, we're getting ahead of it because I wanted to lay a little more foundation, but we'll say this one too. Just this past weekend, today's the 26th of October, right? And so this past Sunday, up in Albany, the governor of New York had, there've been an Occupy Albany group that have been congregating on they call it the Quad, I guess. There's a square between where the governor's mansion sits and the legislature and stuff. And the governor and the mayor of Albany decided that they had to get out, and so the mayor directed the police department to clear the
Really,
Quad.
that happened up in Albany.
So here's what happened. What happened was the chief of police said, you are outside of your rights. The people here have every right to be here. They're not a danger, a threat, or a nuisance to anyone. I refuse to do it. And the police department refused to do it.
Wow, I didn't hear about that.
Not only did that, but they made a public statement about it. And this guy stood up to not just the mayor, who's his boss in a way, but also the governor of the state of New York. So there's some interesting, in other words, as an act of solidarity with these people, because he also said, by the way, we agree with them.
That's kind of some of that Wisconsin effect, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's...
We had the firemen and the police helping out the protesters there.
One of the unifying, public statements is that we are the 99%. You know, it's
And what does that mean? A lot of people are hearing that, and there's the one percenters.
well, we're talking about the distribution of wealth and power in the country.
And isn't that like a big complaint of the Occupy Wall Street?
Yeah,
Because I'm trying to like get some the viewers out there what it is.
Well,
like,
I mean, if you're gonna, as I said again, there's no representative body. Okay, so you can't have like impute what is said by this person or a small group of people to the whole group. Rather, you have to kind of farm from this whole group what it is exactly that they are saying, what it is that, you know, why they're there and all of that. But there are some very common themes, certainly, and some very common statements and some very universally endorsed slogans, basically, that you can cull out of it. One is this, that they are the 1%, we are the 99%. And by that, they're talking about, A, the distribution of wealth in the country, where the top 1% has an extremely inordinate share of the wealth of the country, and the fact that that's been growing.
but also too, we'd add the fact too that they didn't also get that, they didn't get it fairly. That's what I've been reading about
well,
it. Like they rigged the laws, they rigged the lobbyists, they rigged the system.
It seems, you know, I mean, again, some people may have a complaint over the methodology by which this happened as opposed to the fact of it. But it's a very widely held position from the people I've had contact with, and from what I've seen, you know, of people talking on video or whatever, that the fact of this 1% and 99% disparity is also troubling to them. Not just that it was attained unfairly, but that it exists at all, because it's not absolutely necessary for society to continue that this condition exists of this small group owning, maybe a third of all things, and the other 90% or 95 or 99 or whatever it really is, having the balance. Many people that I've talked to that have been involved there, and many people just show up in polling data now as finding it offensive that that condition exists at all, whether people feel they got their extreme wealth fairly or not. So that's one aspect. Another, one thing that might be a shorthand to explaining this. So when I was down the last time, each time I've gone, there's a little table with people making buttons when you first come in the northeast corner of the park, and so I picked up a button each time I went. And the last time I went, there was a button and it had like 5 demands on it, and the one on top was larger than the others. And that was to end all U.S. wars. That was the top thing. Apparently there is extremely broad consensus over this. Now, some of the reasons for that may differ from person to person, or from, area, like New York to L.A. to Chicago to Atlanta to whatever, but that position is very widely held. People have a real understanding of the fact that the money that's spent on war making and on defense, and also this is widely discussed and a consensus position on the prison industrial complex, in other words, on domestic war making, more or less. That
war
is
drugs too.
Yeah, all of that. Well, that's all part of that construct, the criminal justice system, the prison industrial complex here. So anyway, there's an acknowledgement, like a very fundamental one, that's a big problem. Then there's the fact that, and this is listed, that the economy is unjust.
Also, no universal health care.
That there's no universal health care, there's no free education.
Tuition's a big,
right.
Like the $1 trillion in debt. So it's bringing a lot of young people in from.
Absolutely.
Like Bill Maher said it in the way too. Like basically, you do this college loan, and you would own a house if you took that out, but you don't get the house.
People graduate from school with $50, $100, $200,000 worth of college loans on their back, and that's a new occurrence. When I was 18 years old and comparing college tuition, for example, SUNY cost $850 a year.
But wasn't it even free in the beginning?
Well, wasn't at the beginning. The beginning is a few years before me. But in 1972, I graduated high school. And so in 71 and 72, I was looking at tuition. And SUNY, one of the places I was considering going to was Fredonia, because they had a music conservatory, and I was interested in that at the time. It was $850 a year. Now, I have my friend Ben's kid goes to Vassar, and he pays $45,000. I don't know if it's a year or a semester. I think a year. So that's $180,000. Now, some people have that and can write a check for it out of their checking account without even making a transfer. Others won't see that much money in 10 years, and so it certainly skews the opportunities for education very heavily, but also just in terms of, if you're looking at the development of the society, people come into the society from their education burdened immensely, like as if they had bought a house already, but now they have to find a place to live. And so
I think 85% of college graduates now go and live with their parents.
Well, you now have $1 trillion worth of student loan debt. And it's an interesting thing, because this is one of the several responses.
And they don't even have the same protections that if you were in, with credit card debt.
Yeah.
Like you cannot
cannot
bankruptcy.
Right. And which also credit card debt has been changed in the last few years too. But so anyway, so that's a big issue too. The health care is an extremely big issue. Also, housing, because people are being foreclosed and evicted all over the country. That's a big issue too. And finally, even though there are a multiplicity of approaches that people are taking in Los Angeles and some other places, they're openly hugging the police and trying to draw them in. As I said, in Albany, for example, the police, and elsewhere, the police are taking positions in solidarity.
Not in Oakland, though, last night.
Not in Oakland, and not in Atlanta either.
They used tear gas last night.
Yeah, they tear gassed them. And in fact, this morning on CNN at like 7 o'clock, so it was like 4 a.m. in Oakland, the guy doing the interview couldn't, there was still tear gas. You could see it. It looked like he was, on the moors in Scotland or something. And so anyway, the shorthand of what they're looking for has to do with ending the wars and perhaps just the militarization of the country in general and the security state here. The student loan debt, or education in general, free education, free health care, and jobs. Big jobs probably really belongs on the top, but the economic security and economic justice, I think, would be the thing that would subsume all the other elements of that. And so that's kind of what the organizing conditions are around it. Today's New York Times had some polling information about it hasn't been positioned this way, but more people support this group around the country than don't. But not only that, they've been holding out both Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, as sort of kin. And one reflects the lack of faith in government, and the other a lack of faith in the private economy. Okay, that's kind of the subtext. There's a left-right paradigm. What they haven't said is that the number of people that support the Tea Party, as opposed to the number of people that support Occupy Wall Street support in the general American population dwarfs support for the Tea Party as it's understood by, in the body politic.
So it's basically the corporate media getting it wrong, then, just
right,
reporting their narrative.
The reason the thing that's interesting about this data is that Tea Party, if you have 5 Tea Party people assemble on a corner, the media is there, and they get to speak straight through, all the other, there's spin and all that goes on too. But and I mean, the thing itself is an astroturf. At least what we see now.
The Koch brothers.
Yeah, and Dick Morris and all these other people that have.
Did you hear that fact about when they gave Hayek Award? Hayek,
yeah.
That they actually and he was the guy that was anti-Social Security.
Right.
And he didn't want to visit the United States in '74. They wanted to put him what later became the Cato Institute. And they said, don't worry, that you taught the University of Chicago for 10 years, and you're actually entitled to Social Security. It just came out in some letters. So while they're talking it down, they're being the ultimate hypocrites.
Yeah, he's working on it.
Yeah.
And make sure I get mine.
Yeah.
So anyway, the support for this it certainly warrants some very deep coverage rather than and it's that issue's been forced. In New York City alone, the stream that they issued would have the first few weeks. 3 o'clock in the morning, you'd see that there were like 5,000-7,000 people or something watching.
I was up there in Times Square when they came. Did you see any of that?
A week ago Saturday, I was in when that happened at Times Square.
And the police almost started a riot. They brought the horses in.
I heard what happened. I was at Zuccotti Park when that happened. I arrived at noon to meet someone. We were supposed to do interviews with some people then, but it turned out I had to go up to Penn Plaza to do a press TV piece at the studio up there, which was a live piece at 2:30 that afternoon. So I left about 1:45. And then I had to come back and meet this other person. So I got back about 3:15. So I ended up just shuttling back and forth between Penn Plaza and Zuccotti Park, and I missed when everybody left to go up to Times Square.
It was a scene.
Now, while Times Square was packed, Zuccotti Park was packed too. Now, I don't know the capacity of that block. 5,000 people, 3,000 people, something like that. That many were at least there at Zuccotti, and there were thousands more up at Times Square. And then also, there were thousands that were just marching. Different. These are each 3 different groups of people.
Because I was there, I don't know if you were, I was there at Union Square when they did the pepper spray.
Yeah.
I happened to come out, I was on my way to yoga class, and I almost got caught into it. And they bought the orange nets out.
Oh, wow.
And I almost got dragged away with it. And I was like saying, like, I'm sympathetic to these people, but I'm not part of this thing today. And the cop didn't care. And then you turn around and they bought the spray out. I watched it, like, and it was one of those rare times I didn't have my camera because the light was bad.
Right.
So I wasn't expecting to see it, and they came down, and I watched it, and they were like just putting them down, the spray, the mace and stuff.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it up close. Not with respect to this. I remember, for example, the 2008 DNC in Denver and RNC in St. Paul. I saw a lot of it. And also in New York City in 2004, and go back, I can go back 20 years. That's a common. So apparently there's something different fundamentally, though, that's happening because in some places the police are actually taking the side. And also you had the situation where some members of the military, including Marines and
I heard like the veterans came up.
And also some active duty members.
There was one active guy too. You hear about the guy in Louisville?
Yeah.
Who went on the side?
Yep. But they came into New York City. This group came up and said, we are here to defend the protesters from the police. So it's an interesting phenomenon. That's the short answer, I guess. Just in terms of what's happened around the country.
And also worldwide. It's also now gone worldwide, right?
Yeah. It's very hard. I mean, again, you have small groups that are discussing, these, arriving at a consensus on issues and then trying to bring them out to work, to have work done on them. And this has happened in more than 900 cities in the country now. Someone set up a website where you can go to with your group and be listed, and then start.
Yeah, we're thinking about starting one in
Chappaqua.
Chappaqua.
You should. I think it should be one in Ossining and Port Chester and Yonkers and such first. But I think there is an Occupy Yonkers already in it.
We're going to set up by Bill and Hillary's house.
Yeah, be a good place to start. I don't even want to go there. But anyway, so they've had these websites like acting as a clearinghouse, basically, so people are aware of what's going on in other places. And now you have to figure out how to construct. You have all these elements. How do you make a whole out of it without losing the democratic?
Do you think it'll
character
become like a big mass movement, like some people?
Well, what's happened? You have to look at history. Whenever you ask yourself questions about social movements, you have to look at history for models. It doesn't necessarily follow that what happened before will happen again, but certainly many of the people involved have looked at history, and so they may try to tug it that way. And also, things have happened before for external, extrinsic reasons. It's sort of like water going down a channel. If there's a channel, then that's how it's going to flow. And human development is like that. So anyway, some things that have prior, like historical, you could look at a historical precedent. For example, in Russia in 1905 and 1917, you had spring up in opposition to the Tsar's rule, and basically a sort of feudal slash trying to become industrial society involved in imperial wars and all of that. You had workers' councils spring up. And the first was in Petrograd.
Those were the Soviets, right?
Yeah, which Workers' Council, Soviet is a Russian word for Workers' Council, and Soviet. And so what they had first in Petrograd, and then elsewhere. Petrograd was in 1905, and by 1917, after November of 1917, suddenly the government structure of the country was a configuration of these Soviets that now existed all across the land, and so these councils. So how that happened, there's extensive writing about, there's a huge historical record, and so you can look at how that developed, and that's one of many models. And then there's also models for using or attempting to do direct democracy. I mean, in the 1960s, for example, this was a very popular concept. You look at the civil rights movement and other, look to India with Gandhi, how like large mass movements were configured. You look at Algeria, how the revolution there took place, where you had I only knew two other people involved in an armed struggle. And by the way, this is, let's march to Times Square. Let's let's schedule another meeting for tomorrow afternoon. The kind of that stuff too. And then the the interesting part to me is that every time there's been an attempt to, and there have been a number of attempts from the beginning to co-opt it from all sides, the form has proved so far highly resistant to that. That's why people give me, well, the Democrats are trying to co-opt it, the Working Families Party is trying to co-opt it, the Soros and all them are trying to co-opt it, and I say to them, yeah, I'm sure that's true, but the model, when people actually are democratically governing themselves, then these other people, their actions are irrelevant because that business just continues. Maybe they are throwing their voice into the discussion, but unless there's somebody there saying, well, let's vote on this, we love George Soros or whatever, then after they get their bit through there, they're gone. And right now, those things are being done based on seeking position in the existing external structures, external to this Occupy Wall Street movement. That is, the Democratic Party is looking to jockey for position, say, in the 2012 elections, under the assumption that there will not be a radical transformation of society between now and next November, and that election will be held, and that the country will be governed on the basis of that election. That's the assumption, and so they're positioning for that. Probably that's what's going to happen. But because if you look at Russia, for example, although again I'm not using this as a complete model, but they had the first Soviet in 1905, and the revolution didn't take place until the beginning and end of 1917, 12 years later. Yeah. But it may be that these little embryonic self-governing structures, given the conditions that people face here, and given the external dynamics that are going on, where we might see a collapse of the banking system in Europe and something much worse than we've had so far here in a matter of days, months, whatever. When we don't know, but there's an awful lot of you know, heavy buildings standing on real shaky foundations right now, and things, activity like shaking it back and forth. So who knows? So Soros types, whoever, I'm using just that as one of the examples that people talk about on Facebook, they may all be playing to the game that they expect to continue, that they're coming from, but it may be that that game ain't even going to be there by the time, you know, next month or next year comes.
Well, no one thought it would even be this big now. Like Bloomberg thought when the first frost was going to come, it would be done, right?
Yep. Yep. And many of us that were paying attention at the time, the first thing we were doing was like trying to help empower people who wanted to do this elsewhere.
Because I know when I went down there, I was amazed by the food kitchen, how orderly it was, and the supplies and stuff.
That's all, you know, there's a lot of things that people
that showed me it was like for real.
Yeah, people are doing this stuff themselves. You know, they don't have...
and then when I went down there, it wasn't just like hippies or just radicals, although they were there. No, there was like grandmas, like with signs saying, I'm angry, you know, I've been ripped off, you know.
If you look at not just the present composition of who's there, but if you look at polling data and economic data, this is a fire that is smoldering in like a really, really fertile environment, like a really oxygen-rich atmosphere. And in addition to that, there are a bunch of really big, really rusty oxygen tanks standing next to that room where that could spring leaks at any time. So the question is then, okay, if this continues to grow and if there's either some catastrophic or just some qualitative level that's reached where there's suddenly a different relation even of this phenomenon to society, you know, how do you guarantee its democratic character continues, and how do you stitch between these various constituencies and groupings some sort of capacity for broad-based, unified action? You know, there's an old political science thing that, I forget whose quote this is, that if you're going to fight organized money, the only way to do it is with organized people. And so there will have to be some means of drawing on all of these groupings to push forward whatever the common agenda is of each.
But so far they've been able to get that consensus.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's going to be interesting, and there's an awful lot of cross-pollination that's going on. I'm talking to people on the ground in Chicago and Atlanta, and a friend of mine got arrested in Atlanta last night, for example. And
but they haven't arrested them yet, right?
53 people were arrested in Atlanta last night. Yeah, last night. Yeah, they raided them.
I thought they had 2 days to get out of there.
Nope, threw them out. So, and that was a change in what the mayor had said. Somebody pulled his strings, apparently. So, but in any event, so yeah, a friend of mine got arrested there along with 52 other people last night. And been talking to people like on the ground in each of these places, and they are telling me, well, yeah, there's some people came here from New York. They were helping us with this. Or actually, I was in New York 2 weeks ago, and I saw how they did it. So when we came back, we had a big discussion about it, and we, you know,
it was interesting when I was up in Boston on an unrelated thing. There was people from New York, and the Occupy movement was just starting there. And you can see
cross-pollination. And in Boston, what they did was they tried to crush that early, like
over the bridge.
First week, yep. And it's more resilient than that. There's, like I said, I used an air metaphor before. I'll use an earth metaphor. The soil is extremely fertile for, you know, the growth of this kind of movement.
So the Occupy Wall Street's tapping into something that's real. There's a legitimate anger out there.
Well, the actual complaints happen.
In other words, feeling how like
being felt by
like how the banks got bailed out, but nobody with their mortgages.
Yeah, I mean all of this. Look, if you're black or brown in this country, you know that the economy is a catastrophe because you've been experiencing it you know, much more broadly and deeply than the white middle class, for example. You know, there's a black middle class and a black bourgeoisie and a brown, all of that. But chances are, if you were black or brown, you're much more likely to be poor in terms of
Wasn't
wealth.
their unemployment rate 25%?
Yeah, it's been a catastrophe among young black men, like 40% and stuff like that. Okay,
and more likely to go to jail too.
Yeah, much more likely to go to jail for much more minor offenses than even take place in your average boardroom or your average village or town council.
Wasn't that why they're probably upset? Like no one went to jail for like the crimes?
Yeah, there's all these things, but the point is this. The point is that there's a large sector of society that has been in crisis for a very long time, but it did not suffice to move the entire society because there was such a large portion that was privileged to be excluded from that, not based on anything else but their race or their social coincidence. And they suddenly, that's been the basic stability before for this country, are facing the same conditions. Their kids are now the ones that are coming out of school with a $200,000 student loan debt. Their mortgages are now in foreclosure. They're being evicted from their apartments in New York City because they're no longer rent controlled. All of these different areas of privilege are evaporating under their feet. Their savings are being wasted, and that hasn't really happened to the fullest yet, aside from having to pay their mortgages and student loans for their kids and health care costs and all that. They printed a couple $1 trillion worth of money the last couple of years. We haven't seen the real inflation yet. We're starting to get a taste of it in commodities prices, but you know, you might see very well might see what happened in Germany, you know, post World War I, yeah, where you had wheelbarrows full of money. Well, under a condition like that, people who right now have a few $100,000 in the bank and figure that that's a cushion between them and being in the street might find out that that's what it costs to buy a loaf of bread. And that kind of thing can happen like that. And now suddenly, you've had, you know, this permanent quote-unquote underclass, quote-unquote, this group of people who've been getting it, you know, over the head for generations. Now the stalwart of the society is falling into that through foreclosures and unemployment and everything else. And then you look at this last item, you know, that is a potentially revolutionary situation. Now the problem is, what direction does that revolution go? Because, and again, we're not talking about with guns, we're talking about just that where will society go from that crisis. It can get much better or it can get much uglier. And it depends. I mean, this is the choice that was before Germany after World War I, where they were talking about having democratic socialism in Germany, and instead they ended up with Hitler. You know, the potential for Hitler here is very high. The very first thing that I said,
or like a right-wing populist.
Well, yeah, that's what Hitler was. This condition here, where, you know, like a third to or better of the population was allowed to be treated that way for all this time, means that it is quite possible to go to a scapegoat solution to the political crisis of the upper class, where the problem isn't the 1%, the problem is them guys. Let's get them.
Wasn't that part of like how they're demonizing the immigrants?
That's one of the things that's happening. But again, there's obviously been a political soil where, you know, a black man, young black man, could be as likely, or whatever the respective ratios are, but end up in jail as easily as they could end up in college. And where, in any event, if you go to the jails, the faces there are black and brown in the main, even though as a percentage of population, it shouldn't be reflected that way. So if that happens in this society, and your average white person is not your average middle class person is not out on the street pounding their fist on the ground saying this is not right. So it is quite possible for the society to go that way. But this nascent democratic movement that's taking place in this country, which requires people who could end up here to get involved as part, because the democratic model means you show up, you're heard, just like everybody else.
Also, you have to be informed.
Go there in numbers. Everybody has to be informed. The solution.
And hasn't that been part of the problem too? Is like the
media.
mainstream media has been doing celebrity coverage.
Sure.
Like
they know more about Lindsay Lohan than they know about.
like Clinton
this.
said, like was saying, or one of those guys was saying, like 9/11 happened a big result because there was that first terrorist attack, but nobody cared about that prosecution. They all listened to the OJ trial.
Well, not only that, I mean that's important. Kucinich and 9 other members of Congress.
Like with Cynthia McKinney. In other words, it goes back to like you don't get to hear other voices.
Here, right now, Dennis Kucinich and 9 other members of Congress have a lawsuit pending against Barack Obama, which claim that he's in violation of the War Powers Act and the Constitution, and asked the court to direct the armed forces of the United States to leave Libya and come back. They filed that suit, I don't know, May or June or whenever.
Yeah, remember you talking about that?
Okay, now. That has not been in the media at all, except a little blast when they first filed the suit. There's been active pleadings and all kinds of stuff. But the trial of the doctor accused of, negligent homicide in Michael Jackson's death is on CNN every day. Every day they talk about it for 15 minutes at a clip.
And
they got
HNN,
experts
all those
and everything.
Fox.
Right. Okay. Here's something fundamental. The President of the United States, if the allegations are true, has been committing mass murder illegally with our tax dollars on Africa, okay? And that is not discussed at all, or is the fact that members of Congress, Republican and Democrat, filed a lawsuit in the federal court system making that claim, laying out evidence of it, and asking the court to put an end to it. But one guy's trial, the death of of a pop star, that is wall-to-wall coverage. So yeah, there's a problem with people being informed. That's a consequence.
Wasn't that
of that.
part of the Occupy Wall Street's complaint too? How the media is in bed with these people?
What's been signature with this movement is that they set up a camera and they stream it live.
What I thought was interesting too was you saw the corporate media, and they would find people that weren't so articulate about what they were doing down there. You know, they would find like the clowns. Well, they weren't clowns. They just weren't as articulate. And then I was saying on other like more progressive things, people were very articulate what the movement was about, very what their complaints were about. And you didn't get people who were focused. Did you notice that going on?
Yes,
like they would just find like this.
There's a bias in all media. Look, if I cover something, I bring a bias to it. If you cover something, you bring a bias. It's inescapable. It's just true. And so when you start looking at, Capitol has recognized this and acted aggressively since the beginning of mass communications in this country to dominate the apparatus that is used for people to do consensus building in terms of a narrative.
Well, you were mentioning the other day, like how like a lot of people think Bill Clinton was this great thing, but he signed that Telecommunications Act, which allowed. I don't want to get into bill bashing, but I'm saying how
I don't think of him as
no, but I'm saying how people go for the images and liberal,
right.
Like
yeah, of course.
And here he was doing like these Republican moves, and he signed away Glass-Steagall.
Look at what he's doing in Haiti. And this is a guy who held himself out as America's first black president. Some of the most racist things this country has done in its history, and that's a considerable history of that. Okay, a country founded on racial genocide and slavery. Some of the most racist things done by this nation in history were done by Bill Clinton as president. Okay?
Now, would you say that's part of the Occupy Wall Street's complaint? Like,
so
it's the Republicans, Democrats, they're not representing us. Yeah. We need to get back to this consensus.
The structures.
Would you say that's a fair
work.
assessment?
People do not believe.
That's kind of interesting. The structures are not working.
That's right. They don't care who's manning, the machine anymore. The machine doesn't work. That's what the consensus is. That's the point of creating new machinery. That's what they're stumbling through right now, successfully so far. The apparatus is broken. The polling data all says that. Again, in government, Congress is in single digits in terms of an approval rating. Single digits.
It's the lowest in its history.
Okay, yeah, ever, since they started polling. Whether the government can do anything about the economy. 22% think yes. That's a remarkable number. What do you think of Wall Street? What do you think of people with wealth? What do you think? All this stuff, way different picture than it was 5 years ago. Way different. And so,
which says something for people even to wake up that much in this country.
Well, they were pushed out of bed. That's what happened. This crisis, you have a business cycle in a market economy, a capitalist economy, whatever.
Always.
Up, down, go back to the tulip panic. the beginning of the the
Dutch.
first European markets. Yep, in Holland, and they become more and more acute over time, and Marx, but this is about any economist really with any sense at all kinds of capitalist economists, and anyone who was born after 1850 understands this is the nature of it. And so those that would like to make the system work and work better for either the system's sake or the sake of some subset, like this group or that group, look to ways to manipulate the market economy, mitigate the business cycle, goose it here, tamp it down there.
Also create the safety net.
Right. You have Keynesian version, you have all these different things. And then you have safety net, which is a part of that construct. So, they have more or less, we have more or less seen an acceleration of the contradictions that exist in that kind of a system over the last 30, 40 years. And they've used a number of tools to avert them. But people's wages have been going down since the late 70s.
Which they used the credit card thing.
Right. They had various types of credit were used to make that invisible in terms of what they consume. I can still eat in a restaurant. I can still do this. I can still do that.
Flat screen TV.
Whatever. Now, big thing was the wealth, both in terms of savings, what your savings represented as a portion of the whole of wealth. So that's really, wealth is a relative concept. So if I have only $100, but there's only 1,000 in existence, I have 10% of the wealth that exists. I'm a pretty rich guy.
Yeah.
Okay. If I have $1 million, but there are 85 quadrillion dollars in circulation, I ain't so rich. So that diminution of savings has taken place over like monetary reasons, and people were encouraged to convert the equity in their homes to basically capital they could use it to consume with. So that mitigated, again, their consumption, up until the point where the debt exceeded the value of the collateral, and the incomes were driven so far down that they couldn't support the amortization of the debt. That's what just happened.
That's when brought in the subprime crisis.
Well, that's just a symptom of it. But that's the essence. That's an essential. That's one of the that's been replicated elsewhere in the economy. Basically, that particular thing that people call that's a big part of this. But overall, the problem is that the wealth of the majority of people has been consumed. That there's a huge bubble of debt that cannot be paid back, that has represented wealth on the books of banking institutions and pension funds and other things. They have huge repercussions across the society, and because of this debt problem and this diminishment in income, they can't blow air back into the system like they had done, using Keynes and other similar approaches to it. And finally, the big problem in a very short summation of it, there was a class war. They won, the 1% or 8% or whatever you want, it really is. They won. Game's over. Now what?
And so you feel like the Occupy Wall Street's trying to address that, or coming up with an answer?
Well, it's reacting to the fact of it. It's people, again.
Because again, like Reagan said, the rising tide. They've been hoodwinked, and they're starting to see how also they were hoodwinked on the cultural wars.
People were buying bigger houses and managing to make the payments, so their kids were growing up. First they were, in the 50s it was a 900 square foot house or whatever, in a little cul-de-sac, and then but anyway, most recently they're you're in a 3,500 square foot house and on an acre of land, and you're paying the bills, you're straining, but you get to go to the islands once a year or twice a year,
with
and
a nice car.
The kid gets to go to college and you drive a nice car. You're broke.
Yeah.
You don't own a damn thing, and your situation is scary looking forward. But what they would do, as they kept sucking more out of it, I did title insurance. I've been at tens of thousands of real estate closings. I've seen this phenomenon since the 70s, but it really accelerated, where 8 years ago, somebody would buy a house here in Newcastle. They'd pay $600,000 for it. So they would get a $450,000 first mortgage at 75%, and then they would get what's called a HELOC, basically a credit card secured second mortgage for $150,000. So, and then they would take that $150,000 advance and use that to help pay for the house too. So they're buying $600,000 house basically with no money. Now, I'm seeing like a 33-year-old guy sitting across the table with his like 33-year-old wife, who is getting a little big right around here. They're making the assumption that their income is going to increase because right now they both work. But she's going to be home with a kid at least for some months and paying some medical bills and other things. The couple doesn't know that even though the real estate taxes on the listing were, $9,000 because the property was vacant most of the year, next year it's going to be a $30,000 tax bill. And what they don't realize here is that the teaser rate they got on their mortgage that's allowing them to live in this big house for $1,900 a month plus the taxes, another $3 or whatever, when it actually hits, is going to go up to $6,000 a month.
That happens to a lot of people in the subprime crisis.
But what would happen is when it first, they read it, but everybody's expectations are what they are. And a lot of people assume that if the bank had lent me the money, they know better than I do. It must be that I'm right. I can pay this back if I just, keep my nose to the grindstone. Well, then what happened was, as it would start to go like this, the property values were still going up. So the banks, the industry, whatever, the interest rates would go down. So I closed, say, 8 years ago at 6%. Well, 2 years later, they cut them down to 4.5%, and my house went from $600,000 to $800,000. So now I can pull some money out, pay the old mortgage off. My payment went down. Looks good. That went on at different stages. That went on from like the late 70s until 2007, 2008, when it started to come out. Really, you saw it happening. The default rate started happening in the fourth quarter of 06 and first quarter of 07. But you didn't start seeing real a discussion of it, even admission of the fact that there was a problem, recognition of it. And
well, look at Greenspan, who's considered like this great economic genius.
Yeah, right.
Or Richard
Yoda.
Or Rubin.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the two of them.
And that goes back to one of the themes I explored, is how I guess in this case, the financial media, they weren't doing any reporting on them. Because they are also, they like to go to those lunches. They like to get that access.
Let's look at Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal, but let's look at Bloomberg, the outsider. He wasn't talking his media weren't talking about that stuff, and they're very influential. And somebody needs to pin that on him.
Well, a lot of people now read that too, or he got a lot of, even if it wasn't his own media, he knew a lot of the editors run the thing too, and they wouldn't write critical of him.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, that's another problem. But that's. So anyway, I guess how do we sum it up?
Yeah. Where do you see it going? Not that you're like the great sage, but
it's going to go somewhere. It's going to either grow or die, right? And if it grows, how do you grow it? Make it a qualitative leap, so that rather than being a number of very interesting, disparate individual groups, it becomes ultimately perhaps the way we now govern ourselves, losing the republic and all of that, and big corporations and all of it, the existing economic structure.
Let's not forget the Supreme Court putting in the United.
All of that. If that model no longer applies, then that case is essentially irrelevant. That pertains to how next year's presidential election, congressional election, etc., will be conducted in terms of how much money can be used to influence it. If those structures are washed away, it don't matter. So, and I don't know that that's what's going to happen, and I don't believe necessarily.
Isn't that part of it? None of us really know, right?
Exactly.
Is that what makes it exciting too?
It's exciting, and it's also, we're not talking about a football game. We're talking about the fate of our species in a way, and more so than at any point in history, because this is an international phenomenon. We have, economies and political structures, military structures that are global in their scope. And the repercussions of global upheaval could be global, and if it creates a catastrophic failure of systems, like if these fall or
like Spain and
continue,
Greece.
and if they continue, it may be that that's what kills us, because it just doesn't function. If it continues and doesn't function to help us sustain ourselves, then we might be looking at some very dangerous things. But we're also looking at some very promising things. The trends on the ground are very promising. It's just that people need to pay attention, keep their eyes open, and try to be as involved themselves as they can, because if true democratic structures actually evolve from this, then it's the responsibility of everyone to be heard, to make sure they maintain that character by their participation.
So Don, thank you so much for coming on and offering your insight.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thanks
Great.
for having me, Bob.